Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Google Hangout, first Google Hangout for Course 3 of Civil War and Reconstruction. We are broadcasting live from the Columbia Center for New Media, Teaching and Learning. Tonight we have Columbia University librarians Ty Jones and Mary Freeman, who are going to talk with us about the fantastic primary sources that they've been curating for us. Two small housekeeping items. If you want to ask a question, just click on the small grid icon in the upper right of your screen, and we will be live for the next hour. So without further ado, Ty and Mary, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here. Mary, it's an honor to be here with you. So we're just seeing the questions now on the screen. The first question is, how do you pick the primary sources you give us to analyze? Also, do you draw on more sources than just Columbia University's holdings? An excellent question. A good primary source for our purposes has to be related to the week's lectures and readings. It has to be visually exciting. We try to avoid just using dry textual documents, which rule out the vast majority of the library's materials. But most importantly, they have to be unique insights into the larger historical questions that the week's subject matter deals with.
Yeah, and we try to choose sources that are unique or as unique as possible to Columbia's holdings. Some of the sources we've used are available from other libraries, especially printed things like newspapers and pamphlets, but anything that's handwritten is definitely unique to our collections. For example, the letter that we used last week, the Frederick Douglass letter, that letter was something that we sort of knew that we had, but something that we're really excited to share with the public because it's something that exists only at Columbia and is something that otherwise members of the public would not be able to see unless they came to this library and looked at it in person.
All right, are the documents in the Columbia collections available for public viewing? They are. The reading rooms at Columbia are open to students and non-students. More than 40,000 research requests were processed and serviced at the Rare Book and Manuscript Library last year. And so anyone can come and use these materials during library hours. They don't circulate, but you can access them in the reading room under the supervision of the staff there. Columbia Library's website has an archives portal that allows you to search the vast majority of our collections. So they're readily accessible, and librarians can assist anyone's research requests to help them find specific things that interest them. The Civil War and Reconstruction is one of the real collection strengths for the libraries. So what we've been showing so far has just been a tiny sampling of what's here.
And also, if you're interested in something that you've seen on the website so far, a lot of the documents that we've shown are parts of much larger collections. So if you see a letter or an image that interests you, if you look at the caption on the image, you can see what collection that item is drawn from, and then you can go online to the library website and find out more about the collection. So if you're interested in a particular topic, the images on the site are really just a starting point for your research.
I'd like to talk about this question about the most exciting artifact or document that we've discovered. It's hard to choose just one, and so I won't. There's two that really spring to my mind. One was used quite recently for the start of this course 3. It was that original ink cartoon about the Birth of a Nation and the protests against the re-release of the T.W. Griffith movie And that was something that we really just stumbled on in the middle of a scrapbook, an original piece of art that's really amazingly striking and which had just been folded up and kept in a box for the last 99 years or so. And then my other favorite is something we used quite early on. It was the goods of chattel for a slave owner in Georgia. And it's just an amazing document that shows all of the possessions of this wealthy plantation owner. And it begins with his human property, and then without pausing, it then describes his household goods. And it's just an amazing, really tangible window into the way people were seen as property in a relatively uncomplicated way back then, although there were nuances. I think that's a very shocking document for people to see now.
Yeah, I think both of those are really, really exciting. Another one I would add to that list is the document actually that you found, the petition written by the citizens of Charleston, the freed people of Charleston, immediately after the end of the Civil War. This was a sort of a list of resolutions written up by a group of former slaves, free Black people in Charleston. That was, I thought, really got some great discussions going on the course, but also is just a really unique document that so few documents like that have survived, and just has this very, very rich language that expresses the feelings of, embracing freedom, claiming rights, and this enormous sense of dignity and entitlement that former slaves felt after emancipation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it should be said, I mean, each document we use is literally unique. Even the printed materials, there might be a handful of other copies in other major libraries, but there are marginalia and idiosyncrasies of each individual one. And one of the great joys of this course, and one of the ways that we think about our participation in it, is just like Eric Foner, by doing these lectures online, has been able to reach a really broad audience in places where there may not be access to scholars of his caliber readily available. We have been able to use the materials in Columbia's library and really disseminate them around to students all around the country who may not be able to access those types of materials. Not every college, and certainly not the typical high school, has those types of unique historical documents. So I think we kind of work in tandem with Professor Foner to really distribute that sort of level of unique historical learning through this course.
Yeah, and I mean, a few of the printed documents we've used are things that are available through other library websites in digitized format. But in some cases, you have to have sort of an institutional subscription to those websites. So the great thing about this is that the content is, available to anyone who's enrolled in this course for free. It's not behind any kind of institutional barrier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about what makes a good historical document for use in an online learning environment. When we started working on this project, we felt that there was a real need for coherent and thoughtful pedagogy based on these types of digitized primary resources. And we talked about this a lot. Looking around at the web, there are a vast number of digitized unique historical documents. The project of mass digitization has been going on for more than a decade, and at this point, there's probably millions of important historical artifacts online. But no one had really put sustained effort on the question of how you use that huge number of materials in kind of authentic historical learning. So what we really wanted to do is go from a really large scale situation where you have all these millions of unfiltered documents and instead think in a very intimate level. And that's why every week we really focus on one or at most a small number of digital materials and try to have the user and the students really engage with one or two primary sources with a little contextual information and also some guiding questions. So what type of document is especially good for that type of learning? Things that are surprising, I think, things that really give you a very personal sense of how history is lived on the individual level. So we have these bills of sale for individual slaves that give biographical information for a single human from 200 years ago or so. Something like that is a much more concrete way to think about large questions of slavery than reading the sort of overwhelming stories of tragedy and resistance. So that's kind of what I looked for.
Well, I just say that, we're really lucky in that we have the backbone of Professor Foner's lectures to work from. So we know that the students are coming in with a certain amount of historical context. They've heard the lectures, watched the videos. So that gives us a lot more, freedom to focus in on these individual stories that can, supplement, highlight individual lives that otherwise can get kind of lost in the broader narrative that Professor Foner is providing. And another issue, I guess, on a very practical, logistical level is that we have to choose sources that, are kind of exciting to look at visually. I mean, in some cases, we've had more luck with certain topics than others, but one issue is kind of just the legibility of the source in terms of handwriting. Sometimes we've provided transcripts of the sources, but we want the source to be accessible to anyone who's looking at it. We don't want people to have to do too much deciphering. Looking at a computer screen and trying to decipher handwriting is actually much more difficult than looking at the handwriting on the page. So that's one consideration. So actually, I think a lot of weeks we start out with a body of, 5, maybe even 10 different items, and then we kind of narrow down to what is the one thing or two things that really encapsulate the message that we want to send, what gives the best kind of window into this topic, and, what will we think maybe, provoke the most exciting discussion on the course website.
Yeah. All right. We have a question about restoration work. How much restoration work typically goes into making a document ready for display? For the most part, these materials that we use are in relatively good condition. There have been a few instances where we felt that the materials were too fragile for use in this project, but the library has a photo unit which is dedicated to taking archival quality digital images of these materials in the least effective, least harmful way possible. All of these items have survived rather miraculously for well over a century, despite the odds. And for the most part, they're still much more durable and sturdy than paper materials made today. But we're certainly very careful and cognizant about the fragility of these materials. I don't think anything that we've used has had to be restored before we've used it. Some of the materials might have benefited from a little cleaning or so.
Yeah, and I think one thing that has kind of happened is that a lot of times when we're looking for the sources, we're actually going into the stacks of the library and kind of digging through boxes to find things that we didn't know were there. So sometimes we'll find, I've found a few boxes where you kind of open it up and are like, wow, there's some great stuff here, but it's not the collection itself. It's not in great shape. So it does kind of raise our awareness of areas in our collections that might need a little extra restoration in the future.
Yeah, and this project has allowed us to discover things that we didn't know about. I mean, that's one of the most valuable aspects of it for us, is the chance to stumble across things that we and really no one else knew were in the libraries.
Yeah, it's really like a kind of fun detective project every week, to think about what would be a great source to use and to discover things that we didn't know existed in the collections. I mean, it helps us, and it also helps researchers who come looking for things that otherwise we might not have been able to offer to them.
Yeah. Okay. All right, let's do that one. How do these items get into a collection like Columbia's? Most of the materials that we've used have been in the collections for decades and decades. The library is still actively acquiring new materials and new collections. And actually, we recently acquired a new Civil War diary, so we do still find Civil War materials. But most of the materials that are here have been here for decades. They were donated by alums or by faculty members who were doing their own historical research. New York City was a center of abolitionism, as anyone who has read Professor Foner's latest book will know. So we have many strong New York City abolitionism collections, but we do still acquire new materials. Which sources have provoked the most interesting discussions? Mary?
Sure, I can take that one. I mean, one of the really, so I mean, I'm a graduate student in the history department, so I also work as a teaching assistant in classrooms of students who are physically present, in addition to moderating the discussions for students who are present online. So one of the really interesting things about the discussions I've seen in this course is that because the documents are presented online and people kind of have the World Wide Web at their fingertips, they can do a little bit of outside research before returning to the discussion and making their posts. So it's been great for me because sometimes I can learn kind of contextual information about the documents or about the events that they're describing that I wouldn't necessarily have known otherwise. One of the discussions from this current course, the third section of the Civil War course, that I think has stood out so far is this discussion from the Charleston petition of colored citizens. That petition, one of the questions that we asked people to think about was to look really closely at the language of the document and pick out what kind of keywords stood out to people as particularly important or powerful in the claims that these people were making. And I thought that the discussion that resulted from that was really wonderful. People like really picked up on some of the words like rights, citizenship, things like that, that, you know, if you just kind of glanced over the source really quickly, or even if you read the source, if it was reproduced in a book somewhere, might not be as powerful as actually seeing the words on the page.
We, for the most part, have been digitizing materials, especially for this course. So there may have been a few instances where something had been digitized in advance, but for the most part, we have done our own research into the collections and have found relevant resources and have had them digitized specifically for the weekly course modules that we've put together. When it's finished, we're planning to do an online exhibition of all of the images together as a whole. So there will be a permanent legacy of these materials that we found that will persist after the course is over.
Yeah, and maybe this is a good time we can talk a little bit about how like the sort of primary sources for this course originated last year when Professor Foner was, doing these lectures in person for the first time at Columbia before they were put online. Ty and I and a few other people got together and put a physical exhibition together for the Columbia undergraduates in that course. And that was so successful that we ended up starting to digitize some of the items from that exhibit. So we kind of started out with this basis of maybe 15 or so items that we knew were, great ways to start talking about these topics. But as this course has expanded into more weeks, we've had to come up with more and more sources, which has been a great opportunity to expand this kind of basis of sources we had originally.
Let's take the next one. As communications and writing become digital, what will archives look like in the future? Good question, Lucy. If you can imagine the challenges faced by archives in preserving the written record that existed in the 19th and early 20th century, it's actually quite daunting. And I don't think most people think about how much of the historical record has been lost, and not just the ephemeral parts of it, but actually crucially important historical artifacts that we would all be thrilled to have had preserved that are gone. Things like first drafts of important documents. Columbia has the first draft for one of John Jay's Federalist Papers, where you can see through his crossouts the various permutations of his thinking about this crucial national founding document. In the age of word processing and emails, the first draft is really a thing of the past, and no important collection related to a scholar of this generation will be about papers. It will be about emails and word processing documents. So archives all around the world are dealing with this question of how you archive digital historical materials. The problems are, they go on and on. For instance, if someone made a word processing file in MacWrite or WordPerfect or other defunct or nearly defunct platforms, there's now no computer that can read them. If someone stored their files on a floppy disk or a zip drive, there's no way to access them. So Columbia has a machine that can read any word processing file, and actually has disk drives for any form of disk ever made. And we would provide access to researchers in the reading room of emails and things like that. So libraries are trying to answer this question, but the best way to do it is just for everyone to print out all of their emails and save their printouts. That would save us a lot of trouble.
But I mean, the point that you make too about kind of the thinking about the things that have already been lost, even in archives that are, preserving actual paper records. If you look at the archives at Columbia, or pretty much any archive, the documents you find are, representing legal records, institutional records. If there's correspondence, the correspondence mostly of important people. Not so the sort of records of ordinary people are a lot harder to get at, even in existing archives. I don't want to give too much away, but next week we're going to be looking at a source that, is really unique in that it's something that has survived, that's really an artifact of everyday life in the Reconstruction era in the South. And those kinds of sources are often the hardest to come by in the archives. Sometimes you can only really get the name and the age of someone from a census record, but you often can't find, personal letters and diaries from people who are not, people of substantial wealth, political power, or otherwise considered important by the people who assembled the archives, perhaps 100 years ago.
Yeah. I'm going to ask the bottom one. For each of you, what has been the most surprising? I know we've already answered this question, but I have another set of ones that were fun that I've recalled. We used the Lincoln life mask.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a bronze rendition of an original plaster mask that was taken of Lincoln the day that he won the nomination for the presidency in 1860. And it also has a set of hands, which were the original hands that became the model for the statue on the Lincoln Memorial. And the hands have this odd object in them, which turns out is the end of a broom handle. And supposedly Lincoln had shaken so many hands that day that his arms were shaking and he was having kind of a muscular problem. So he had to hold this broom handle so that his hand could stay still enough to be captured in the molding. And I think we used that artifact to ask a question about communications and about sort of political campaign publicity. It was such an ordeal to sit for that plaster cast experience that it really gave a sense of how important it was for a presidential candidate to have everyday Americans have this very abstract vision of what he actually looked like. This would have been the only way really for the majority of people to see a candidate's actual facial appearance. So that one also was surprising.
Yeah, and Lincoln was one of the first presidents to be president at a time when photography was becoming more widely available. So he was one of the first presidents that, people around the country would actually have been able to see a photograph of him rather than just a drawing or a print or a sculpture or something like that. So, Lincoln is, important in many ways, but also important because he was president at a time that the American people were kind of changing their sense of what it meant to know their president, that they were actually familiar with what he looked like and might have an image of him in their home. And the collection that the Lincoln mask comes from has a whole range of items that have the image of Lincoln on them. So it's interesting to see how his image, kind of changed over time and got disseminated in a variety of forms.
Yeah. I guess we can ask this question about letters and diaries. How useful do you find personal diaries and letters as compared with public bills of sale or low circulation pamphlets to get a sense of these historic times? In our research, to speak for both of us for a moment, we would find them extremely useful and important. And in a certain sense, scholars will gratefully use any evidence they can find. But there's nothing better than finding something so personal as a diary or a letter, although they each carry their own problems in terms of authenticity and trustworthiness. And we've used a few diary entries and some letters. Most recently, this amazing letter that Mary found from Frederick Douglass. But for the purposes of this course, we really wanted to focus on things that were more visual, which is why maybe letters have been a smaller percentage of what we've used, but that does not actually reflect the collections here. That's really the specific nature of doing these online learning modules.
Yeah, and I think we've tried to select as diverse an array of items as we can feasibly in the scope of the course, finding things that match up to the topic at hand, but also trying to incorporate some letters, some diaries, but also some more popular sources. A couple weeks ago, we had the pamphlet about Andrew Johnson that had a lot of kind of political cartoons that were not so kind to him. But, it's, I think, depending on the questions that you bring to the source, something like that can be equally enlightening. As in that week, we also had a handwritten letter by a Northerner who was living in the South and writing to his senator about the Reconstruction policies of the Johnson administration. So we kind of purposely paired those two sources together to show that, you can have a criticism of Johnson that's being widely circulated in this pamphlet format and a cartoon, but you can kind of get a whole different set of questions and information from a letter that's written by an individual that's having a particular set of experiences that might not be completely related to what's going on in the pamphlet.
Somewhat beyond the scope of this course per se, as archivists, do you have an opinion about having document collections generally available on the web, e.g. readily accessible via something like Google versus being held within the purview of Columbia? We are certainly in favor of the widest possible public diffusion of our archival materials. And really the only thing that would ever limit us from distributing things freely and widely would be the limitations of copyright protection and the practical question of limited resources and time for digitizing collections. So yes, as archivists, we are in favor of that, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, also, it's sort of the physical limitations and resource limitations. Like Ty and I are the people who are literally scanning most of these documents. So clearly we have an investment in having these shared with a broad audience, but there's, I don't know, like miles of material in the library of, miles of stacks. So you need like a robot or something to scan all of that.
Yeah. How long does it take you to find and decide on the source of the week? What's the longest time, more or less, the shortest? We would like to say we plan these weeks in advance, but often we are thinking on a week-to-week basis. Usually we have a sense of what the topics are in the coming week, and we will discuss possible collections where we might find relevant and interesting materials. But I would say each of these takes us a day or two to put together, think about the questions, work out what contextual information is necessary to make sense of the materials, and then put it all together. Mary has done the bulk of the work lately, and she's been terrific.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also varies widely week to week. So I mentioned next week we have a source that I think we've been kind of holding in reserve, waiting for the right moment to bring it out, because it's, we're really excited to have it, but we want it to be paired at a time in the course that makes sense. So that week, we have it relatively set. We just need to work on questions and things like that. But other weeks, definitely, at the beginning of the course, we have a list of all the different topics that are going to come up in the lectures. So we use that as a basis to think about what types of sources, what types of topics would be especially good. So for example, the Frederick Douglass letter that was up last week, at the beginning of the course, I saw that there was a segment in that lecture about, I think it's about women's rights and the relationship to the voting discussion going on around the 15th Amendment. And I personally am interested in that as part of my research for my dissertation. So I was really excited about that particular topic, and I knew that I wanted to find a source that highlighted that topic. But then when it came down to it, it was really a matter of me a day or two before going into the stacks and digging around and finding that amazing letter, which was really, kind of lucky moment for me. But, it's always kind of percolating over time, but really the actual work of putting everything together can go pretty quickly.
Are there specific strengths and weaknesses to using primary sources in teaching? You want to start?
Well, I think, a point that you brought up earlier, that using primary sources can offer kind of an individual window into the personal lives of people who are living through particular moments and events, can be something that is more powerful to students than simply hearing overarching narrative. It's a lot easier to kind of make connections to your own life when you're looking at a letter, a diary, or even an image, than it is sort of hearing about the broad, the big questions in history. So that's definitely, one of its strengths. I think that you do still need those big picture, framing context to help you, I guess, analyze the primary source to its full extent. But I do definitely think there's some value in, encountering a document or an object without very much context and having to do a little bit of that detective work on your own, because that can help you, think more critically, and, something that applies beyond simply taking a history course, actually in everyday life.
Yeah, I definitely like the phrase about detective work. A lot of times in history teaching, there is a sense that primary source in and of itself is something that's good for students to have access to, which of course we believe in, but I think too often it's assumed that a primary source is somehow a kind of especially authentic way to look into history, or somehow in and of itself will provide a more authentic vision of the past. One of the most common questions I think that we've asked in this course is something along the lines of, what other questions would this resource make you think about, or what other information would you need to know in order to understand the nuances of this document. So I think one of the most valuable things that these primary documents can do is raise questions. No individual item is going to be able to answer a major historical question, but because they're often surprising and they often seem to contradict common historical knowledge, they can really spark interesting other lines of inquiry. But until you do that, they are, literally unintelligible. They're illegible. You can't read them in their own context. So I think one of the fears that we have, and we try to work with this, is people will see a primary document that seems to speak directly to contemporary issues, or will seem especially relatable to someone's own life. And we try to give just enough information about each document to have participants think about them in a historical way, instead of immediately referring them to our own experience, which I think is a very common and natural response.
And I mean, I think it is a way, I've seen students who come to the Rare Books Library in person and look at these documents in person, I think have a similar reaction to what I see happening on the discussions for this course, which is that sometimes seeing one of these documents after hearing some of the lectures and reading our information and questions can, get people really excited about a particular historical question or historical topic. So ideally, primary sources, a single primary source can't answer a research question on its own, but ideally they can get people excited about investigating those questions further on their own, or, with the help of a librarian.
Yeah. This question asks, can we talk about copyright issues as they pertain to archival documents? Yes. Anything that was created before 1923 is in the public record. So even though these materials are physically owned by Columbia University's libraries, the university itself does not hold the copyright to these materials. So researchers every day come and digitize out of copyright archival materials for use in their own publications. And the library itself does not hold the copyright, so we do everything we can to facilitate publication of these materials. Materials created after 1923 are more complicated, and materials created after the 1960s are even more complicated, but under terms of fair use, researchers can access them for their own research needs. But if they want to publish materials that are still in copyright, they would have to get the permission of the copyright holder. Are most of the primary historical sources in the reach of scholars, or do there exist known collections which remain in private hands? There are thousands of important collections in private hands, and new discoveries are made all the time. There was a new first folio of Shakespeare discovered in the past few months, which no one would have expected. I mean, it's sort of a known unknown. We know that we don't know that there are many important collections that we do not know yet, but they certainly do remain out there. And if any of you has them, please contact us.
And I mean, I think it's every historian's dream is to come across a box of letters in someone's attic that has never been used, that, you know, offers amazing insight into whatever historical topic happens to be of interest. But actually, I think, you know, there's actually a lot of collections that are within the reach of scholars, but aren't actually being used to their full extent, partially because it's only recently that most libraries' collections are fully searchable online. So that information has certainly expanded the use of these collections, but also sometimes the way the collections are filed, it's very difficult to actually know what is in there until you're physically present and digging through the boxes. And I mean, there's just a lot of undiscovered materials. I mean, we've experienced that firsthand looking for the materials for this course. But I mean, another example is Professor Foner's recent book about the Sidney Howard Gay Record of Fugitives, which has been sitting in this library's collections for 60 years, right?
Yeah.
And certainly people have used that collection. Many historians have used that collection for their research and have used documents in publications, but Professor Foner was still able to shed light on this source that people really didn't know about, even though it had been, you know, easily accessible for many years.
Yeah, which raises you know, an important point. More important than the materials that are still undiscovered is the fact that scholars now are interested in historical questions that they weren't interested in the past. So even the idea that you would be interested in rediscovering hidden materials from African American history would not have been so intuitive until surprisingly recently. And even for things that are well known that have been studied, each generation of scholars, each historical moment brings its own new set of questions to past materials. So there are always new questions that can be asked of archival collections, even if they have been discovered in advance by others. How much of the Columbia holdings have been digitized? How much is added each year? I mentioned earlier there is a digitization laboratory here that digitizes materials Monday through Friday, 5 days a week, and has been doing so for a decade or so. And Columbia has recently added a portal which allows access to tens of thousands of digital images. But despite this, the percentage of the holdings that have been digitized probably hovers around 0%. As Mary mentioned, there are 14 miles of unprocessed materials and many other many more further miles of processed archival collections, which will never be digitized. Each archival box can hold hundreds of individual items, most of which don't warrant digitization. So it is unlikely that even in the age of mass digitization that anything like a large percentage of archival materials will ever be digitized for use. What we're doing instead is digitizing highlights of the collections, which can give a certain sense of the entirety of the whole, so they can be a valuable research tool, and also online fully searchable finding aids allow far more access than was previously possible. But the experience of historical research will always be dealing with boxes, folders, and pieces of paper in a reading room. I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Maybe floppy disks also.
And floppy disks eventually, yes. Yeah, what have we learned through the process of our work with this MOOC? Well, we've learned a lot about our own collections. We've refined the process of identifying materials that we think will work for participants and for the weekly discussion sections. We have kind of taken it as a learning experience about what types of questions work, what types of questions don't work quite so well. And we haven't exactly sifted through this information, but we're excited to actually analyze what participants have accomplished and try to see how we can improve for the next online course. Do you have any specific lessons?
I mean, I think we've, like you said, I think probably learning how much context we need to provide for documents to have people, feel like they have enough of a footing to discuss them. Also, again, like the questions, knowing, I mean, I think sometimes we've had questions that seem to kind of drive everyone into one particular answer, which is not ideal. We want to have a pretty open discussion. So I think, going back over the discussion responses once we've gone through the whole course will give us an opportunity to fine tune what types of questions do work and what types of questions don't work, and perhaps which documents were of more interest to people than others. So I think we both see it as a process that's not, once we put up the materials for 1 week, that's not like the book is shut on that week. It's constantly kind of evolving as we go along.
Well, I see, especially what to an archivist does not warrant digitization. I think that is a reference to my earlier comments about mass digitization. Well, I mean, not to make any value judgment. I mean, the collections are filled with junk mail and scrap paper and newspaper clippings that are available elsewhere. But it's not that there are things. It's not that they do not have their own special interest, but the majority of the materials don't warrant the financial commitment and the commitment of labor hours to digitize them. I mean, we are curators, so we believe in curation in the sense that we can select interesting materials and offer access to the entire collection. But there are institutions that have digitized entire collections. The W.E.B. Du Bois collection is entirely digitized with more than 100,000 individual images. So there are examples of individuals who are so prominent and so important where every scrap of paper that they came in contact with would be worth digitizing. So certainly someone who's writing a biography of one of our collection creators would want every piece of information digitized. So it's not that it won't have value to someone, but our ability to mass digitize is limited.
And I think the digitization process is driven by the research needs that we identify or that we anticipate. If you get something particularly exciting into the collections and you want people to know that you have it, then digitizing it is a great way of doing that. And also, the teaching needs, it's a teaching library. So perhaps some of the more heavily used items, heavily taught items are things that would be prioritized over things that are not used as much in the collections or that we don't foresee having a strong research interest from the community.
All right, let's do we think there are gaps? Let's try to answer that
Yeah,
one.
that's good.
Do you think there are gaps and overrepresentation in types of content, and does that affect scholars' view of history? Why don't you start?
Well, I mean, one of the challenges that we've encountered in putting the materials for the course together is that Columbia University is an institution located in New York City. It's a institution whose alumni, especially from many years past, are fairly wealthy people or were fairly wealthy people. So a lot of times the collections that have accrued here are collections that document life in New York City from the perspective of, sort of an elite group of people, especially if you're looking at, the 18th and 19th century. So one of the challenges we've encountered is, first of all, how do we incorporate materials that give a perspective from the South or the Confederacy during the war? And also, how do we incorporate materials that have perspectives of people who are less well represented in history, who may have been illiterate, or whose writings were not deemed worthy of preservation by the sort of elite forefathers of Columbia. So, especially, I don't know that we've had a lot of sources written by women in the course so far. We have had sources that document the lives of slaves, but most of those sources were created by elite members of society, slave owners. The will, the goods of chattel that you mentioned earlier would have been written by a slave owner. It's not a personal record of the experience of slaves themselves. But we have had success in incorporating those perspectives, but it certainly, can draw our attention to some of the strengths and weaknesses of the collections that we have here.
Yeah, for social historians who are interested in history from the bottom up or history of everyday people, the main problematic is discovering the voices of people who were not represented in archival collections. Reconstruction is one of those rare moments when African American voices were being heard. And if you think about this week's primary sources, we have those testimonies about violence in the polling station in Georgia, where you mentioned illiterate people. There was the testimony of people who attempted to vote, but who were not permitted to vote by armed whites, and then they each signed it with a mark.
Mhm.
So here was a case where people who couldn't write did manage to get their voices into the historical record, albeit through the intermediary of the notary or whoever was taking down their deposition. In general, when you see everyday people, women, minorities in the archives, you often see them at their worst. This hasn't come up so much in this course necessarily, but one, the most valuable records for historians tend to be legal records, charity records, and it's almost always you as a historian are accessing these people through the voices of others, and these others tend to be hostile witnesses. So the main challenge of trying to tell this type of history is navigating a deep imbalance of sources. And this was true about archival collecting until the past few decades. It's still true that most of the collections that come in are still collections of famous people, prosperous people.
Yeah, and I would add also that, especially in this third course that is on Reconstruction, it's really exciting for us to be able to bring to light sources, including the Frederick Douglass letter and the resolutions from the people in Charleston that are, documenting the voices of African Americans in this time period, because one of Professor Foner's great achievements, as well as other historians of the more recent era, is to kind of contradict these narratives of Reconstruction as a disaster that gave too much political power to African Americans and resulted in a period of chaos. So it's really important for us to show that we have these sources that demonstrate that African Americans were claiming their freedom with a great sense of dignity, and were entitled to the rights that they were hoping to receive at the time.
There was a question about the MOOC as the future of history education. I don't know if this is one to end on or where we are in terms.
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Well, I mean, we have really enjoyed working on this MOOC, and one of the reasons that we were able to engage in it wholeheartedly is that we know that Professor Foner stipulated that the MOOC would not be offered for credit. So I think that just like these primary sources are an amazing way to add to historical conversations and synthetic knowledge, this type of digital learning really allows the kind of wonders and the wealth of an institution like Columbia to spread across institutions, hopefully into high schools, as well as institutions of higher learning. But of course, we can't overlook the fact that many institutions are using digital learning as ways to replace junior faculty. And certainly I don't think that this is a replacement for in-person learning in the classroom level, but perhaps it can be a useful way to supplement that.
Yeah, and definitely based on the discussions, I think sometimes I think it would be wonderful if we could have an in-person discussion that incorporated the documents, but also was a more, live action format rather than kind of the delayed responses of the posts.
So, Ty and Mary, thank you so much for that. That was just fantastic. We just want to say we appreciate all the time and effort that you've put into curing these. You've just made the MOOC even better. So thank you very much for tonight. Thank you for joining us. Our next Google Hangout will be April 9th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and we'll have Professor Foner at that one. So thank you for joining in tonight. And if you have any other questions, maybe you guys could they post them in the discussion area. You could, if your question wasn't answered, just post it in the discussion area. We'll create a space, and Ty and Mary will get back to you. Thank you very much. Bye.
That's good.